Hi, my name is Darren Joseph from HJ Tax. Today I am talking to you from Singapore. It is early September 2023. Last night I had a Zoom call with some other cross-border tax professionals. We were talking about tax planning for American clients, whether they be citizens or green card holders who are moving abroad in general or particularly to Europe. Now, it was an interesting conversation, but we spent a lot of time talking about trust. I listened for a while, but then I raised 2 points. The first is that many jurisdictions in Europe do not recognize trust because they're civil law in the first place, not common law, because remember, trusts are a creature or creation of common law. But they're civil law and they may not have signed and or ratified the 1985 Hague Convention on Trust. So for example, France, I think they signed it, but they didn't ratify it. Spain and Portugal haven't even signed it, right? So that's the first point. And then second, just you need to consider that trust law has evolved along different paths in England, in the US, and in different areas of the Commonwealth. So it is possible perhaps to identify different trust models. So arguably I'd say that there are four models of trust internationally. There's a classic English trust. There is secondly the Caribbean or offshore trust. There's civil law trusts, and there are the American trusts. So four. And if the client becomes tax resident in another jurisdiction as they leave the US and that jurisdiction does not recognize trust the way the Americans do, or the way the American system does, understand that the courts can interpret things differently and therefore unintended consequences. Let's talk about foundations. Foundations as an essential pre-immigration tax planning tool for that US exposed individual moving perhaps to a civil law jurisdiction in Europe or anywhere else. But what exactly are foundations? Well, foundations were originally conceived in medieval Europe in relation to charity, so charitable purposes. They were actually the first instance of legal persons, a concept that lies at the basis of Western corporate law, so it's quite familiar. In the US context, the term is more or less, I would argue, this is my perspective, it's more or less synonymous with charity. So if you think about the Ford Foundation, we think about the Rockefeller Foundation, we think about the Carnegie Foundation. But internationally, when we talk about asset protection and estate planning, there are a variety of foundation or models of foundation, well beyond the well-known nonprofit type. What I want to talk about now is private foundations or family foundations. So family foundations evolved in continental Europe over the centuries in a way that's kind of similar. So it was meant to perform the same functions typically associated with private express trusts in the English legal tradition. The typical, but today when we look at advertising material from corpsec firms or from trustees or on private foundations, regardless of the jurisdiction concerned, it tends to be represented as quote-unquote just the same as trust but better. For example, private foundations are often represented as legal arrangements that can achieve the same purposes of trust, but at the same time allow the founder to enjoy a high degree of flexibility than the average trust settlor. Now, these are obviously oversimplified representations, and as is always the case, you need to get legal advice, particularly for that jurisdiction the client is moving to. That's super important. You can't do any tax planning independent of where the destination is. So the reality is that foundations are in many cases just the same as trust, but different. They're different because they're legal persons and they're creatures of statute, not of equity. So that's one point. And then also consider that foundations are different. There are different types of private foundations, right? So the practice of private foundations has generally evolved into three models, at least you can make that point. The first is the classic family foundation that was originally codified in Liechtenstein in 1926. This is Personen- und Gesellschaftsrecht, in English, so law on persons and companies. The second would be the Dutch foundation, and the third will be common law foundation. So this is where private foundation statutes have been, at least in the last few decades, enacted in a number of common law jurisdictions to create a combination of trust law and company law principles. Now, the presence of different models of private foundations can lead to unexpected results, such as the lack of recognition of certain types of foundations in certain civil law jurisdictions whose legal system didn't contemplate another model. So, for example, I'll give you two examples, right? For the first example, this is a decision in 2008 in Spain. So the Spanish tax authority in charge of the land register denied a Panamanian foundation the right to register Spanish properties in its name because Spain recognizes only charitable or public interest foundations. That's one. And then secondly, in a decision in 2009 in Germany, the regional appeal court, this is the Oberlandesgericht of Stuttgart, refused to enforce the terms of a Liechtenstein foundation because of the extent of the powers retained by the founder. So what is my point? My point is that as a US person moving from the US to another jurisdiction, you really need a joined up approach that considers the tax system in the jurisdiction that you're moving to. Bear in mind, especially in Europe, taxes, the tax regime is a lot more aggressive to some extent than the US. Generally speaking, tax rates are higher. So then the US really ceases to be your main problem. The main problem really is planning, not just for the US, but especially to the jurisdiction that you're moving to. My name is Darren Joseph from HTJ.tax.
So if you're a 6, 7, or 8-figure investor, entrepreneur, or business owner who needs a tailor-made solution from a qualified team of professionals, we can help you achieve the international lifestyle, the freedom, and even the tax savings you're looking for. Visit us at htj.tax and live that international life.